Hey guys, it's good to be back with you today for another devotional as we're actually starting to get close to the end of our time in Hebrews. Our section for today is Hebrews 10, verses 8 through 10. And the first half of chapter 10 is really focusing in on the glory and beauty of the once and for all sacrifice that Jesus made for us. If you remember from an earlier devotional, the Levitical system and priesthood was insufficient because the sacrifices in that system were endless. And like it says in verse 1 of Hebrews 10, the law and everything the law required was a shadow of the good things that were to come. So we're going to start in verse 8 and walk through our section today verse by verse. So starting at verse 8, it says, "When he said above, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings. These are offered according to the law." The first thing that we want to note here in verse 8 is the fact that it says God neither desired nor took pleasure in sacrifices and offerings. Now, at first, that can seem really confusing. How can we say that God didn't desire sacrifices and offerings when he was the one who established that very system as a way to draw near to him in the Old Covenant? Now, I think the best way to understand this is to start by remembering all of the prophetic passages in the Old Testament that warned about God's displeasure with sacrificial ritual. This is important. The warnings do not condemn the sacrifices themselves, but they do condemn the hypocrisy of those who just went through the motions without their heart being engaged at all. Now, I'll give you an example of this. King David in Psalm 51, where he's crying out to God, and he says, "For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with the burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. Oh God, you will not despise." And another example we can look to is King Saul. In this story, God had commanded King Saul to not take any of the livestock that he had captured from his enemies. What did he do? He disobeyed God and he took livestock. Then, when the prophet Samuel confronted King Saul and challenged him for his wickedness, how did he respond? He offered a few of the animals he stole out of disobedience as an offering to God. He was basically trying to manipulate the Levitical system as a way to pay off God for his own disobedience using the very animals he wasn't supposed to have. Now, the prophet Samuel responds to King Saul, and he rebukes him by saying, "What is more pleasing to the Lord? Your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice? Listen, obedience is better than sacrifice, and submission is better than offering the fat of rams." God desires obedience from us, not sacrifices to cover our disobedience. So in verse 8, when it says God hasn't desired or taken pleasure in sacrifices, I think it's best understood to see this through the hearts of those giving the sacrifices. And if we're honest, this could be even said about our worship today. How many people each Sunday go through the ritual of worship without their hearts being involved at all? So on to verse 9, which says, "Then he added, 'Behold, I have come to do your will.' He does away with the first in order to establish the second." The purpose and fullness of Jesus' life was to do the will of the Father. Jesus perfectly submitted and obeyed God's will. And because of this, he entered into heaven on his own merits. This is how Jesus did away with the first covenant in order to establish the second covenant. This new way of being reconciled to God through Christ's perfect obedience to the will of God. His work, his obedience, his submission. All of the things we cannot do, but because of our faith in Jesus, his merits and work are now applied to us. And finally, we get to verse 10, which says, "And by that will, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all." And this last verse is giving us a conclusion that provides hope to us, because through faith in Jesus, we are made holy. And holiness, the very thing we need, the very thing we lack, we know that by nature we're sinful and rebellious, and yet our hope becomes anchored in the one that lived the life we were supposed to live. And I feel the need to say this only because we've talked a lot about obedience. When holiness and obedience is preached, people can start to accuse you of legalism and a works-based gospel. So I just want to be really clear. Our works can and never will save us. Salvation, as we see here in these verses, was purchased through the obedience of our Master, and it's our faith in him that saves us. But I will say this. It's a quote that comes from Martin Luther, and he says that we are saved by faith alone, but the faith that saves is never alone. In other words, a genuine saving faith will produce works in our life as evidence a genuine transformation has taken place. In Romans 12:1, the Apostle Paul tells us to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, as this is your spiritual worship. So I want to leave you with two things. And the first is a question. Where is your mind and heart in the midst of your worship? And I don't just mean Sundays. I mean every day. The question is, has worship become more of a ritual for you than it is a living and engaged communion with God? And lastly, I just want to encourage us, like the apostle does in Romans 12. At one point in our lives, our bodies were used as instruments of sin. But now that we belong to Christ, our bodies and our lives are to be living sacrifices offered freely by redeemed image bearers of God who long to please their Lord and Savior. I genuinely can say, I hope that is the passion and heart for you right now, that you want to please your Savior because you love him, because he saved you. All right, guys. Love you. Have a wonderful week, and we'll talk to you soon.